the point of this presentation today is to describe some of the characteristics of highly successful coaches, and I'd like to take a moment to talk a little bit about what I've done and how I've come up with this presentation. First of all, the full presentation of what I often do traveling around the country is given the Lessons of Legends presentation, which has really become a little bit more of a seminar with video components and a break and so on. We're looking at almost a 3-hour piece. So the reason I tell you that is today, for the sake of what we're doing, I'm going to try to condense this to about between 35 and 45 minutes in total, and then be able to open up to see if there's any questions, comments at the end of what we're doing here. But I'm going to zip through this relatively quick. I'm going to move quickly in terms of speaking quickly. However, I find the information that I've been able to come across here to be extremely useful. And the point of what I'm doing here is this. I coached for 8 years of college basketball. I've coached youth sports, etc. I was assistant coach for 4 years, head coach for 4 years, before I got into administration, became an athletic director, and Alan's kind of read the rest, got quite involved in intercollegiate athletics. But as a coach, I was always really interested in highly successful coaches. However, it's taken a long period of time before I've really decided to dig into the details of how they did it. You know, I guess most of you listening in today could probably list off a number of coaches you admire or coaches you think are really, really good, whether it's within your sport or whether it's in another sport. You can probably read off the bios of quite a few great coaches. But what I really decided to do was look at coaches that maybe didn't just happen to have a really good recruiting class and win 2 conference championships, or maybe have a great senior class in high school and win a conference title 2 years in a row, or even win a state championship. That's great for those programs. That's great for those schools. But what I'm really intrigued by are coaches that have had a great deal of success and sustained it for long periods of time, for 20 and 30 and 40 years. And I wanted to look at those denominators and say, what can we extract from those coaches that we can apply to our programs and to our lives, regardless of what level we coach, and frankly, no matter what sport we coach. And I wanted to extract those pieces and give those pieces back to you. You know, at times I go around and I get introduced as a motivational speaker at times. That's wonderful, that's nice, but I want to be honest with you. What I really want to do is be an impactful speaker. I want to give you impactful information. I don't want to waste your time or mine. I want to give you information you can take and you can apply to your program and to your life to make your life and your program more meaningful. And so I want to dig into it here. So here we go. Let's see, there we go. Here's the coaches that we're going to run through, and I'm going to zip through these very quickly and highlight a couple of them and jump to the conclusion. But in the upper left-hand corner of the screen as you're looking at it, it's Coach Bob Lattiser, longtime football coach at De La Salle in Concord, California. I'll touch on the bios as we touch on them a little bit further. In the upper middle is Coach Jim Steen, longtime swimming coach at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. Just retired in 2012, as did Coach Bob Lattiser. Upper right-hand corner is Coach Danny Miles, longtime basketball coach at Oregon Tech, still the current coach at Oregon Tech in Klamath Falls, Oregon. Bottom left-hand corner is Coach Don Meyer, longtime college basketball coach, many of you may be aware, from Hamline, and has spent the bulk of his career at David Lipscomb in Nashville, Tennessee, and then the last 10 years of his career at Northern State in South Dakota. Sadly just passed away this past summer of 2014. In the bottom middle is Coach Joe Ehrman, assistant football coach at Gilman Prep in Baltimore, Maryland. I will detail why we're highlighting a assistant high school football coach as we get to Coach Joe Ehrman, who is hugely impactful. In the bottom right-hand corner, you're probably well aware of the legendary Coach John Wooden of UCLA fame, if you will, and we'll dive into more with Coach. But I want to start with a little story as we have this screen up, and I want to start with a real story, so I'm not going to use the gentleman's last name, and I'm going to get to the point in a moment. I was coaching basketball at Wilmington College in the state of Delaware. I got a break when I was young. I started coaching college basketball. I believe I was 21, maybe 22. I was still finishing up down the road at the University of Delaware, and we didn't tell the players that until I missed a game for my own graduation during the winter term. But I tell you that because I got a break when I was early to get my foot in the door, so to speak, as an assistant coach. By the time I was 25, I was named the head coach at Wilmington College, and a few years later, I got a package in the mail, as I often did, and as many coaches do at the collegiate level, from a young man who was interested to come to play for us. At that point, this is a number of years ago, before the DVDs came about, the old VHS tape with the letter, the cover letter, basically saying that the young man, Mike, was interested to come play for us at Wilmington College. So I popped in the videotape, and it was different than any I'd seen before or since. And it was different because typically, as you're aware, you're typically going to get a highlight tape, you're going to get a high school tape, a junior college tape. This one, I got a young man who set up a tripod in his driveway, and Mike had the cracked driveway and the old beat-up basketball hoop, and he sent a video of him doing ball handling drills in his driveway. And the next thing you know, Mike turns it off and then flips it back on a moment later. He's doing shooting drills in his driveway. I eventually called Mike and realized why I didn't get a highlight tape or a game tape of some sort. And I got that information, I got that tape, because Mike went to a junior college and it took him a very short period of time before he flunked out of school. So now we've got a 5'8" guy with no tape who flunked out of junior college, and being the bright young coach that I was, I invited him to campus. And so we were in NAI school at the time, and I told him, Mike, after the season, I can watch you play pickup with our guys if you'd be interested to come on up. And I didn't know if he would or not, but he drove roughly 2.5 hours each way and came up and played with our team. And after we were done, I really enjoyed watching him play. You got a young man who's diving after loose balls, trying to take charges in open gym, and really busting his tail. From a basketball perspective, I really enjoyed him. But in the back of my head, I'm also thinking, he's not eligible. He just flunked out of junior college. So, at any rate, we have the talk in the office after the open gym, and I pretty much hand him a sheet of paper, say, Mike, I don't really particularly like rules for a program, but we do have guidelines. We do have codes that we live by here with our program. I'd like you to take a little bit of time to look these over. And after he did, we talked. And I said, Mike, I'll be honest with you. I like you from a basketball perspective. I can relate with the basketball junkie portion of it, your work ethic. I really appreciate that. But also, let's be honest, you're not eligible. So I'll tell you what, if you can live by these codes that we have and live by these standards we have at Wilmington College, and you go back to school and you get your grades up and you come into school here and you pay your own way, because I'm not going to give you scholarship money, you're not eligible. If you pay your own way to come to school, you're good enough to be on our team. I don't know whether you'll play or not in terms of playing time. Everybody earns that. That's up to you and our program. But he drove back to the Baltimore, D.C. area, and quite frankly, I don't think I ever really expected to hear from him again. But throughout the season, we kept in touch a little bit by phone. And then after the season, I had the opportunity to move down to Boca Raton, Florida, where several years later I became the athletic director. I kept in touch with the old program, some of the old players, and enjoyed watching them play at times, and noticed, though, that Mike had never gone to Wilmington College. I tell you this because 5 years later, I'm now the athletic director at Lynn University in Boca Raton, Florida, and I get an email. Email had come about during that time, and the email says something like this, and I know this quite well because I have it in a folder here at home. And it goes something like this. Coach, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Mike, and of course I remembered him right away. He said, I write to you to tell you a little bit about what I've been up to. And he goes on to tell me that he went back to school, as I had suggested he do at that time, and he wanted to let me know that he went back to school and he did well enough to get his associate's degree. But he continued on in the letter, and he wanted to let me know that he found that he could be pretty successful academically. So he continued on academically while not playing basketball, and ended up getting his his bachelor's degree. And so Mike continued on his letter and told me that he, at that point, was able to transfer his passion, his love for basketball, to academics when he realized that he could succeed. And he felt great about being able to succeed academically. So he continued on, and he finished his master's degree. And at this point, obviously, I'm very proud for Mike for going back to school to finish his associates and then bachelor's and then master's. But then he stopped when he was writing, and he said, Coach, I want to let you know the difference you made in my life. He said, you see, when I sent you that information, about coming to play basketball at Wilmington College. You were the only one that returned my correspondence. You were the only one that invited me to campus, and you were the only one that spent time talking to me, and you gave me hope. You gave me a chance. And he said, and that was an inspiration. And I want to let you know, I was recently asked to write a letter to continue my education. And in that letter, I was asked to name the 3 most influential people in my life. And I named the writings of John Adams. I wrote my mother, and I wrote about you, Coach Mccathy. And I thought, wow, how impactful is that? Here's a young man that didn't even come to play for us at Wilmington College, but yet he's considering me one of the 3 most influential people in his life, and I didn't even realize it till 5 years later when I get this email. Think then about the impact you can make on the lives of young people that you spend each day with, every day of their lives. Think about the impact you can make. And here I was, having moved out of coaching and into administration, when it dawned on me the impact. Now, most of us get into coaching with the idea we can make a positive impact on the lives of young people through coaching, and we get that, but then the ball goes up and the games begin, and we get so wrapped up in scouting and recruiting, and at the college level, certainly recruiting and practice planning, game planning, travel planning, conversations with parents and players, and on, that sometimes we forget about the power of the platform of coaching. And I want to share with you the last line that Mike wrote to me in that particular email. He said, Coach, I write to you specifically today because I want to let you know I just got the letter in the mail today that was my acceptance letter from Harvard University Law School. And I thought, bam, how about that? How about the impact we can make and change somebody's life through the power of the platform of coaching? And it just dawned on me then. And I share that with you because we start talking about lessons of the legends, we start talking about characteristics of highly successful coaches, but sometimes we forget that definition of success and what does it look like. I'm going to jump ahead to a couple coaches. I'm going to jump ahead to Coach Joe Ehrmann and Coach John Wooden, and then I'll pull it together at the end with a little conclusion. I'll pull some of the other coaches back into it when we get to that point. But I want to hit on a few particular lessons with these coaches. So who is Coach Joe Ehrmann, and why do I want to highlight somebody who happens to be an assistant high school football coach? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about Coach Joe Ehrmann. In short, Coach Ehrmann was an all-pro defensive lineman for the Baltimore Colts before they moved to Indianapolis. He eventually became captain of the Baltimore Colts, and he wanted to get, eventually as his career finished up, he wanted to get into coaching. That's what he knew. However, let me back up for a moment and tell you about a turning point in Joe's life, and this is very impactful when it comes to coaching. When Joe played for the Colts, his younger brother was the closest human being to him in his life. His brother Billy was 18 years old when Joe was several years into playing for the Colts and came down to spend the summer with Joe as he had the preseason workouts with the team. Well, all of a sudden, Billy got weak, and eventually they went to check him out in the hospital to see if he was okay. The long story short is that Billy got cancer at 18 years old, and Joe was back and forth between practice with the Colts and the hospital over and over and over throughout the summer as he watches his young brother Billy get eaten away by cancer. And eventually, during his 18th year, Billy passes away from cancer. And it completely changed Joe's thinking as a human being. He went on a search for meaning at that point and read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and it completely changed his life. Later in his football career, and then after he retired, he went on to school to become an ordained minister. And Joe ended up with a congregation of 3,000 people in Baltimore that were part of his church eventually. He went on and continued to have conversations with one of his best buddies, Biff Poggi, in the Baltimore area. And their conversations at lunch during this time after Joe finished his playing career were this. What would happen if we got our own team? How would we actually teach life lessons and character through sports? So many coaches talk about, hey, we want to teach life lessons through sports, but here's one of the things I learned personally years ago. I got to the NAI National Office in 2007. By that point, I had coached 8 years of college basketball, been an athletic director, been on the NCAA basketball committee, chaired all kinds of committees, created the Collegiate Basketball Invitational, and quite frankly, I was feeling pretty good about myself a few years ago, that I was on a pretty good track and things were going quite well. Well, I walked down the hall one day in the national office a few weeks after I got there, and ran into a gentleman who I knew and I had had great respect for. A guy named Rob Miller was formerly the president of the NCCAA, National Christian College Athletic Association, and was the face of the Champions Character Program for the NAI. I was out speaking about it all the time. And in our conversation, Rob said, "John, you do realize that sports don't teach character, right?" And I said, "Come on, Rob." I said, "I have been around for a little bit. Of course they do." He said, "No, sports really don't teach character. Because you play volleyball, basketball, baseball, football, soccer, etc., doesn't mean because you play sports you're inherently a better kid. You're a better person because of it." He said, "But coaches teach character and life lessons. Parents teach character and life lessons. People teach them to our youth." And so Joe, back to the conversation he would have with Biff at lunch, realized that they would have an opportunity through sports to teach these character and life lessons, but the big crux of the conversation was, how do we do that? What do we do on a day-by-day and week-by-week and month-by-month basis to actually teach those characteristics and life lessons, etc.? So I want to take a moment and talk a little bit about that, because this is one thing that really successful coaches do, is they learn how to use sports as a vehicle to teach life lessons and character. So I want to dive into this. I'm not going to spend the whole time on Joe Ehrmann, but there's a few really good things. You see, Joe eventually got this team, he and Biff, at Gilman Prep, and they got to be very, very good. Well, eventually, a reporter who used to be the ball boy for the Baltimore Colts comes out to see Joe's team practice after Joe invited him. And what do they see? They see big, hulking Joe Ehrmann, former all-pro defensive lineman, in front of roughly 100 boys, football players, freshman through senior. And he sees them yelling out to the players saying, "What is our job as coaches?" And the players chant back to him and say, "To love us." And Joe says, "What is your job as players?" And they say, "To love each other." And the sports writer thinks, "What is this? This is crazy. These are big, tough high school football players that happen to be very, very good. They're one of the best teams around and often nationally ranked. And we got coaches talking about loving players and players talking about loving each other." And after practice, Joe said, "You know, if you'd like to learn more, if you'd like to see this in action, you're welcome to spend the year with us and come to practice and games and meetings whenever you would like." And so Jeffrey Marks did. He was the sports writer. Well, eventually that turned into a book called Season of Life, which eventually became a New York Times bestseller, which eventually won a Pulitzer Prize, which landed Joe on the cover of Parade magazine, labeled as America's most important coach, as you see on the screen, which eventually led Joe to doing a tremendous amount of introspection, which years later came out in the book Inside Out Coaching, which is somewhat of a coaching Bible today. Regardless of what you coach and which level you coach, I highly recommend Inside Out Coaching. It's just outstanding. And I want to highlight some of the pieces of that book. Eventually I was highly intrigued by the books and got on the phone with Joe, and so we need to go over some of these lessons in more detail. I've got questions. I want to share with you some of the things I learned from the books, and I learned from talking to Joe, and I learned from watching videos and reading an awful lot about him. So here we go. Here was one of the key statements off the bat. Outside of parenting, there might not be a better platform than coaching to transform boys and girls into healthy and thriving men and women. Pretty strong statement. So the focus of Joe and what he tries to teach is the difference between transactional and transformational coaches. And to hit on this very quickly, transactional coaches, as you see in front of you, they have their priorities of coach first, team second, and the player's growth and needs last, if at all. That's a common situation where we see today in sports and society today, from the youth sports on up, is just win, baby. Let's get the best players we can so we can win, 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 win. And if you don't help us win, we're not real concerned about you. We're concerned about the players that help us win, because me as a coach, I want to move up the coaching ladder. I want to get the next best job. I want to make more money, and on and on and on. But the challenge with that, as you can be well aware, is that we are using young people as tools for our own personal needs, as opposed to using the platform of coaching to transform the hearts and minds of young people. So what are transformational coaches? As you see here, the priorities are flipped. It's about players first, team second, and the coach's needs ultimately are met by meeting the needs of the players, as you can see here. So as you'll see, I'm not going to read everything here, but transformational coaches ultimately is where we want to lie and where we want to get to ultimately. And some of you may be transformational coaches already or well on your way. So how do we get there? The internal work is what we want to do. Inside-out process, he calls it, or internal work. In order to do that, we need to come to our own answers to 4 questions and one other important component that I'm going to touch on here. The 4 questions, and by the way, at the end of this, I don't expect that boom, bam, and you're going to be a transformational coach all of a sudden because you know the 4 questions. Remember that Joe took an entire book, for the most part, to answer these 4 questions, and this very other important component I'll outline in just a moment. I'm going to give you the 4 questions. I'm going to give you Joe's answers to these 4 questions, and I encourage you to take the time to do your own internal work to become a transformational coach. So here are the questions. Why do I coach? Why do I coach the way that I do? What does it feel like to be coached by me? And how do I define and measure success? I'll come back to these as we go through them here, if you didn't get those right away. So why do I coach? Ultimately, as you'll see here, Joe took a tremendous amount of time to come to his conclusion, and ultimately, keep in mind, he coaches football, so he talks about the term men often, men and boys, etc. But ultimately, he coaches to help boys become men of empathy and integrity who will lead, be responsible, and change the world for good. It's a big statement. So why do I coach the way that I do? Well, I'll say this. I don't know who's on the other line. I don't know who's going to be watching this in the future. But I can tell you with a high degree of certainty why you coach the way that you do. It's a combination of the way you are parented, the way you are coached, and the coaches that you've surrounded yourself with since you've been coaching. And by that I mean this. If, as a youth, you played multiple sports and had multiple coaches growing up from the time you were young through high school and or college, if those coaches were all transactional coaches and used you as a tool because you were a good athlete, just used you to win games, and when you didn't perform, they didn't need you anymore, and kind of discarded those players that really didn't help the team win, and all they were worried about is win, 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 then quite frankly, that's really all you know unless you've spent a bit of your coaching career around transformational coaches. Now, the flip side of that is if you've had the opportunity, and you will know it, if you've been around transformational coaches, those people that have touched your hearts and mind and helped make you a better person, and you have that wonderful bond and relationship with because they were transformational coaches and invested in you as a person, not only you as an athlete, invested as you as a person and showed you that they cared. Remember, coaches, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So the way you coach today is often a direct reflection of the way you were parented, the way you were coached, and those coaches you surrounded yourself with. I'm ashamed to admit that I coached 8 years of college basketball and I never asked myself this question. What does it feel like to be coached by me? What feelings do my words, actions, and interactions create with my players? I encourage you to dig deep on that answer for yourself, because the further you dig into that, the more likely it is that you're going to really think before you say some things. There's going to be some things you may be used to say that you may hold in now. You may use a different tone. You may reframe or rephrase things if you know that you're going to really hurt somebody by your words. What does it feel like to be coached by me? I mentioned 4 questions and one other very key component. I'm going to jump to the other key component right now. Values. This is really important. I got to tell you, when I started coaching, as probably many of you, you had that thought that you want to make a difference for young people. You can use coaching and really be a good mentor and make a difference. And then we got really invested in the games, and then we really wanted to win, and then we started planning and practicing and so on, which, by the way, is very good. You need to be detail-oriented. However, here's something I never really thought about. If I want to teach values as a coach, if you want to teach values to student-athletes, wouldn't it make sense that you know what your own values are? Especially given this. Notice what I bolded here. The reality is that players evaluate us and learn our values by watching us, watching how we treat them, their teammates, opponents, and other coaches. No matter how well we communicate, they gauge what we really value by our actions. I'm going to jump ahead to something Coach Wooden often talks about. He said, "No written word nor spoken plea can teach our youth what they should be, nor all the books on all the shelves. It's what the teachers are themselves." You know, when I read the book When the Game Stands Tall about Bob Ladouceur, some of you may or may not have seen the movie that's just come out recently. Neil Hayes is the author of the book. Early in it, after spending a tremendous amount of time with Coach Ladouceur over the years, covering him for the Contra Costa Times, eventually for his book, he had a note at the beginning of the book in his introduction I thought really hit it. He said, "De La Salle doesn't win because of anything Bob Ladouceur does. They win because of who he is." I go back to them and tie those pieces together, from Bob Laddister to Coach Wooden to what Joe Ehrmann says right here. The reality is that our players evaluate us and learn our values by watching us. Think about that for a moment. So wouldn't it make sense then, coaches, that we know what our values are, that we've labeled our values, that we've defined our own values, and crucially important, that we then live our values? If the reality is that players are going to learn our values by watching us, wouldn't it make sense that we identify, that we define, and that we live our own values? For example, Joe Ehrmann's values are empathy, kindness, and service to others. You may have 2 values, or you may have 5 values. They take time, literally, during the academic year. They break down a week and they go over their values one by one by one by one and teach them and model them and talk about them and define them, etc. I encourage you to define your values, to live your values, and to talk about your values with your student athletes if you want to make a real impact on their lives. Next is, how do I define and measure success? The answer to that question, ultimately, think about this. Joe defines his success by the effectiveness of his why, and he gives himself a 20-year window to determine whether or not he was successful. Remember, he says that he coaches, his mission statement, if you will, is to help boys become men of empathy and integrity who will lead, be responsible, and change the world for good. Well, if that's his mission statement, ultimately he defines success by the effectiveness of that why, and he gives himself a 20-year window. So think about this, coaches, as I jump to the next one here. You can't define your purpose, or in Joe's case, of saying, my purpose is to help boys become men of empathy and integrity who will lead, be responsible, and change the world for good, and then define success by your win-loss record. Those don't correlate. Ultimately, if his values are empathy, kindness, and service to others, then ultimately is success defined by the measure of the content of their character, their leadership, their contribution to the betterment of their families, their communities, and the world, and ultimately how much they internalize those values from Joe, from their coach, and apply them into their own lives. Ultimately, that is how he defines and measures success. So I talked to Joe. I thought this was really impactful, what you see in front of you here today. When I got on the phone, I said, Joe, I only have so much time with each coach when I get in front of people. I've read a book about you. I read your book. I'm talking to you now. I've watched videos and so on. How do you break it down? What message do you want to get across to coaches? He said, tell coaches, John, if you want to be a better coach, be a better you. Think about that, coaches. If you want to be a better coach, be a better you. I'm going to go ahead and jump to Coach John Wooden, the legendary Coach Wooden. Many of you are aware Coach Wooden's tremendous success at UCLA. 7 straight NCAA Division I national championships, 10 overall national championships, 88 consecutive wins in NCAA Division I basketball, 38 straight NCAA tournament wins. Think about that for a moment. In a 64-team bracket, I know we're at 68 with Division I now, but 64-team bracket, 6 games to win a national championship, and that's a big deal, as you know, to win the NCAA Division I national championship. They won 38 consecutive NCAA tournament games. Some feats that I don't think I'll ever see again in my lifetime in Division I basketball. Coach Wooden, as many of you are aware, was named the Sporting News Coach of the Century of any sport at any level as America's finest coach. So I want to hit on a couple of things. Now, as some of you are aware, there are literally classes taught about Coach Wooden. There are collegiate classes taught on his pyramid of success. There have been more books written on Coach Wooden post 90 years old than any human being that's ever lived. There's a tremendous amount of information out there about Coach Wooden. So I want to hone in on a few important pieces about Coach Wooden. And one is this. One of the important lessons I learned from Coach Wooden was this, and I apply it to my own circumstance, and I'll cite one of my own failings, is this. His definition of success he came up with in 1934. He was teaching and coaching his 1 year in Dayton, Kentucky. And when he was in high school, he was the athletic director, the baseball coach, the basketball coach, and taught English. Ultimately, he came up with this definition as a combination of what his father taught him, along with a little poem that he saw on the wall as he went to get a haircut. I'm going to show you this real quick. This is what his father used to teach him. Don't worry about being better than someone else, but never cease trying to be the best you can be. And he went to get his hair cut in Kentucky, and he saw this on the wall. At God's footstool to confess, a poor soul knelt and bowed his head. I failed, he cried, and the master said, thou didst thy best. That is success. And he thought about that for a while because he had parents that thought that all of their children should get A's. All of them thought their child should have an A. Well, he realized they don't all have the same abilities. Some were capable of an A, and others, if they got a C, that was the best they could do. And so he came up by putting those together as this definition of success, which of course is world famous at this point. Success is peace of mind, which is a direct result of the self-satisfaction in knowing you made the effort to become the best of which you are capable. Now, many of you know that definition, and I've had that sucker memorized for 20-something years at this point. And I used to go around to camps and clinics using this definition of success and throw in Henry David Thoreau's every great and commanding event in the annals of the world is a triumph of enthusiasm, and nothing great was ever achieved without it. And boy, I sounded smart, and I felt like I did a good job speaking. But then here's something that happened as I reflect back on it. And then we get into the season, and we go on the road, and we lose a game, and I come back in the next morning. I remember this vividly. I walk in the office, and the vice president looks at me and puts her hands up and waves to me and says, morning, coach. And I walk by the secretary, good morning, coach. And I'm thinking, did they not read the paper this morning? At that point, the internet wasn't so big at that point. We didn't have the scores on the internet at that point. And I'm thinking, we just got beat on the road last night. It's not a very good morning. We just got beat. And then it dawned on me years later, and I read something that stuck with me, and I'm going to read this for you quickly here. Swen Nader is a former backup center for Coach Wooden and ended up becoming a starting center in the NBA. And he wrote something about Coach Wooden, and I want to put these pieces together for you, and I think you'll see how something special about Coach Wooden. And I'm going to encourage you in a big, big way to try to emulate what you hear here. Success is peace of mind, which is a direct result of knowing that you did the best of which you're capable of becoming. You made the effort to become the best of which you're capable. But there's a difference between being able to give a nice speech about it and living it. Let me read this what Coach Swen Nader wrote. He wrote, I was in the middle of my red shirt year, and practice was about to begin. It was 2:59 in the afternoon, and Coach called us all together at midcourt. Gentlemen, in today's practice, and he went on to talk about what was going to happen in that day's practice, and he said, okay, let's get to the baseline for full court loosening up drills. Hurry up. He said any UCLA player will tell you that that's how practice usually started. But this was no usual practice. It was the one right after we lost our first game of the season in Notre Dame. We were ranked first in the country, and the newspapers shouted, UCLA is beatable. UCLA is at risk of not repeating as champions. So why was Coach Wooden acting as though nothing had happened? I played for 14 other coaches in my career, and every one of them would have said something about that game. Here's the answer. Every practice, he repeatedly told us to make the effort to become the best of which we can be, individually and collectively. He told us, don't try to be better than someone else, but never cease trying to be the best you can be. No one can ask more of you than that. Before every game, the last thing Coach Wooden told us before we went out on the floor to warm up was this: you've prepared to be the best that you can. I know that, and I hope that you do too. When you play tonight, continue to do your best, physically and mentally. If you do, and only you will know that, I want you to have your heads up after the game, regardless of the outcome. I'll be proud of you, and you can be proud of yourselves, no matter what the score may be. So why did Coach Wood not mention that Notre Dame loss during his pre-practice talk? Because he was practicing what he was preaching. No, that's not accurate, Nader said. He was practicing who he was. He was being himself. Coach really believed that the peace of mind in knowing that you've made the effort was much more important than winning or losing a game. No, that's not accurate, he said again. It was the only important thing. When before a game he told us to have our heads up no matter what the score, he meant it. Before that practice, all this jibber-jabber about heads up and doing your best was only talk, because we won every game. When I saw Coach Wooden actually demonstrate it, when I saw him walk the talk, that's when I understood how important it was. That one act may have been the main contributor to our success from that point on. And here's what I mean. That practice session was one of our very best of the year. Many coaches would have punished their players to make them run sprints, or in the very least would have had a depressed disposition that would have set the whole tone for practice. Coach Wooden, with his words and his demeanor, that spoke volumes about effort being the measuring stick, not wins and losses, motivated us to keep improving. Oh, what a fun and productive practice it was. Oh, and by the way, said Nader, we did win the next 88 in a row. That helps. I just want you to understand the point. As I look back on that in my own career, here I am with my head down, sulking. Talk about a depressed disposition. They talk about that was me. But I also realized that that's coaches all over the country. If you win, life's pretty good. If you don't, the head's down and life stinks and it's terrible. Coach Wooden set the standard higher. It was about achieving success, not about winning a game. He often talked that you could score more points than somebody on a scoreboard, but not necessarily win based on his definition. And conversely, you could be outscored by an opponent, but you know that you've given everything you can mentally and physically. And he said nobody else can ask more of you than that. And I encourage you to learn to live his definition of success as opposed to just talk about it. The other point that I want to make about Coach Wooden is going back to what we heard from Joe Ehrman, what I mentioned about Coach Bob Ladouceur, and I briefly mentioned with one of Coach Wooden's quotes, no written word nor spoken plea can teach our youth what they should be. Nor all the books on all the shelves. It's what the teachers are themselves. Well, it's real nice to be able to memorize a quick little poem. It's nice to be able to memorize some quotes from some prominent people. It's a whole different ball game to be able to live it. You see, when Coach Don Meyer called a few months before he passed away, and many of you are aware of Coach Don Meyer, he knew what I was doing, was traveling throughout the country and using some of his lessons as well. And I said, Coach, what do you want me to get across from you? You know, I've got a presentation about you, but what do you want to get across? He said a couple things. He said, one, John, he said, tell coaches, he said, to ask themselves, do they love coaching more than they love winning? Think about that one, coaches. Do you love coaching more than you love winning? And the other thing he asked me to get across to you ties right into what we're talking about right here. He said, remind coaches, their example is not the main thing in influencing people. It's the only thing in influencing young people. Your example is the only thing in influencing the hearts and minds of young people. So I'm going to read one more quick piece about Coach Wooden, and I want you to think about, as we talk about that example being the only thing in influencing young people, and when we talk about people gauging your values by what they see, by how you act, think about the way Coach Wooden acted, and we start putting the pieces together. He doesn't talk about wins and losses. He talks about achieving success, and there is a difference in his mind. He doesn't just talk the talk about being a good example. He is a good example. In the year 2000, one of my favorite writers, Rick Riley, was doing the back page for Sports Illustrated. And here's what he wrote about Coach Wooden. Keep in mind, Coach Wooden's roughly 90 years old at this point in time. He was born in 1910. This is the year 2000. Coach Wooden passed away in 2010 at 99 years old, as many of you are aware. In the year 2000, here's what Rick Riley wrote about Coach Wooden, and keep in mind the importance of your example being the only thing in influencing young people as I read this. On Tuesday, the best man I know will do what he does on the 21st of every month. He'll sit down and he'll pen a love letter to his best girl. He'll say how much he misses her and he loves her and can't wait to see her again. Then he'll fold it once, slide it into a little envelope, and walk into his bedroom. He'll go to the stack of love letters sitting there on her pillow. He'll untie the yellow ribbon, place a new one on top, and tie the ribbon again. The stack will be 180 letters high because Tuesday is 15 years to the day since Nellie, his beloved wife of 53 years, had passed away. In her memory, he sleeps in only his half of the bed, only on his pillow, only on top of the sheets, never between, with just the old bedspread they shared to keep him warm. There's never been a finer man in American sports than John Wooden, or a finer coach. He won 10 NCAA championships at UCLA, and nobody's come within 6 since. He won 88 straight games at UCLA, and nobody's come within 42 since. So sometimes when the madness of March gets to be too much, too many players trying to make SportsCenter and too few players trying to make assists, too many coaches trying to be homies, too few coaches willing to be mentors, too many freshmen without a wedlock kids, and too few freshmen who will stay in school long enough to become men. I like to go see Coach Wooden. I visit him in his little condo in Encino and hear him say things like gracious sakes alive and tell stories about teaching Lewis the hook shot, Lewis Alcindor, that is, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. There's never been another coach like Wooden, quiet as an April snow and square as a game of checkers, loyal to one woman, one school, one way, walking around campus in his sensible shoes and Jimmy Stewart morals. He'd spend half an hour the first day of practice teaching his men how to put on a sock. Wrinkles can lead to blisters, he'd warn. These huge players would sneak looks at one another and roll their eyes. Eventually, they'd do it right. Good, he'd say, and now for the other foot. Of the 180 players who played for him, Coach Wooden knows the whereabouts of 172 of them. Of course, it's not hard when most of them call, checking on his health, secretly hoping to hear some of his simple life lessons so that they can write them on the lunch bags of their kids, who, of course, in turn will roll their eyes. Discipline yourself, and others won't need to. Coach would say, never lie, never cheat, never steal. Earn the right to be proud and confident, he would say. You played for him, you played by his rules. Never score without acknowledging a teammate. One word of profanity and you're done for the day. Treat your opponent with respect. He believed in hopelessly out-of-date stuff that never did anything but win championships. No dribbling behind the back or through the legs. There's no need, he'd say. No UCLA number was retired under his watch. What about the fellows that wore that number before? Didn't they contribute to the team, he'd say? No long hair, no facial hair. They take too long to dry, and you can catch a cold leaving the gym, he'd say. That one drove his players bonkers. One day, All-American center Bill Walton showed up with a full beard. It's my right, he insisted. Wooden asked if he believed in that strongly, and Walton said that he did. That's good, Bill, he said. I admire people that have strong beliefs and they stick by them. I really do, Bill. We're going to miss you. Walton shaved right then and there. Now Walton calls once a week to tell Coach that he loves him. It's always too soon when you have to leave the condo and go back out into the real world, where the rules are so much grayer and the team so much worse. As Wooden shows you the door, you take one last look around. The frame report cards of the great grandkids, the boxes of jelly beans peeking out from under his favorite wooden chair, the dozens of pictures of Nellie. He's almost 90, you think. A little more hunched over than last time. Steps a little smaller. You hope it's not the last time you see him. He smiles and says, I'm not afraid to die. Death is my only chance to be with her again. Problem is, we still need him here. Coaches, I can tell you I've had that experience. I had a chance to visit with Coach a couple times, once when he was 98, once when he was 97, once when he was 98. I went to that condo and I had similar thoughts when I walked out of that condo. Many of you are familiar with this pyramid of success. I'm going to zip right through this and not spend much time on it, but I do want to call a couple things to your attention. The cornerstones are industriousness and enthusiasm. You got to work at it, but have great enthusiasm, have passion for what you're doing. And also remember the top of the pyramid is competitive greatness. And what's it held? What's the glue that holds it together? Faith and patience. A couple pieces on the faith and patience I want to just throw to your attention. He came out with the definition of success that we see in the upper right-hand corner that we highlighted in 1934, as I mentioned. As a teacher, he realized he had now defined success, but he needed to be able to give the roadmap to achieve success. That's what this pyramid of success is. This is his answer as the roadmap to achieve success. But he came out with this in 1948 as he left Indiana State Teachers College to go to UCLA. Think about that for a moment, coaches. He worked on this for 14 years to come out with this. Faith and patience. The other piece of that faith and patience, he got to UCLA in 1948. And all of us seem to talk about the championships and the win streak and the 7 straight titles and so on. Keep in mind, he went to UCLA in 1948. His first national championship was 1964. He was there for 16 years before they broke through to win a national championship. Have faith and patience. We talk about, from Joe Ehrmann, if you want to be a better coach, be a better you. We talk about your example being not just an important thing, but the only thing. And as I mentioned that, take a look at number 1, 12 lessons of leadership. Good values attract good people. Right in common theme, step in step with what Coach Wooden believed as well. I'm going to go ahead and jump to pull a couple pieces together very quickly, and we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I pulled this from Coach Danny Miles at Oregon Tech. I alluded to it at the beginning. Coach Miles, longtime coach, 40-something years now, has just surpassed 1,000 career wins at Oregon Tech, the second coach to ever do so in men's collegiate basketball at the 4-year level. And he talked about making this his Notre Dame. And the book called Make the Big Time Where You Are is from Frosty Westering. I encourage you, coaches that are highly successful, learn to put both feet in and fully commit to their program and not constantly have one foot out the door and looking for the next job, next thing, and so on. I encourage you, if you want to have great success, commit fully to your program. If you're looking for other opportunities, they may come in due time, but they're going to come because you've done great things and fully committed to the program you're in right now. If you want to be a better coach, be a better you. Character and integrity ultimately are critical to sustaining success. Focus on the process. Every one of these 6 coaches, one of the common denominators I found was this. Notice what I put below. Focus on the process, not the scoreboard. Focus on what you can control, not those things that you cannot control. All 6 of these coaches I highlighted, along with others as well that I studied, almost refused to talk about winning. Winning on a scoreboard is a byproduct. That is an outcome of taking care of the details and handling all the rest of the portions. Remember, success, according to Coach Wooden, had nothing to do with winning on a scoreboard. That's a byproduct and an outcome. As I talked about that with other folks, the CEO of a local company who played Division I football had some thoughts, and as he expressed his thoughts to me, I was coming across this article and thought, will these thoughts about focusing on the process and not just the scoreboard, they translate to the proverbial big time? And then I read this from Nick Saban. I don't have to read it all for you, but you can see he focused on the process, not the scoreboard. And then I read this from Tom Osborne. Won 2 national titles as the offensive coordinator at Nebraska, becomes the head coach, and wins 3 national championships. After he heard about Coach Wooden refusing to talk about winning, he said, I don't know that I ever talked to my players about winning. We talked about how you did things, but it was more about the process than the result. One of the winningest football coaches of all time, Frosty Westering, at Pacific Lutheran University. Here's what his son said, who's now the head coach. Frosty unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. He said, my father never focused on winning, yet he's one of the winningest coaches that ever coached the game of football. What do coaches, highly successful coaches, focus on? Details, details, details. As I went through these different coaches, the focus on the incredible, minute details is incredible. And I highly encourage you to become a junkie about your sport. Become a basketball junkie and focus on details, details, details. Here's a couple examples. Picked up from Don Shula, the winningest coach in the history of the NFL. A guy named Mike Harity, assistant athletic director at Notre Dame, did a similar study that I did, ended up writing a book called Coaching Wisdom. It's excellent, with a different subset of coaches. He talked about Coach Shula. Notice what they're focused on. The first step, over and over and over, repeat, 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 details. One of the winningest coaches in college football history is Bill Snyder. I encourage you to study him, some incredible stuff. I don't need to go over everything that's written before you, but he's throwing a fit over sticks of butter versus whipped butter, made sure his team sat on a certain shady side of a plane versus the sunny side of the plane. Who thinks like this? When they went on an away game, he wanted to know the exact time it was going to take to get from the airport to the hotel. He wanted to know the exact size of the meeting rooms so each player could sit accordingly. Who thinks like that? It's almost obsessive about details. I had a person come up to me in Georgia after I finished a presentation a little while ago. Coach said, well, I don't understand what sticks of butter versus whipped butter versus what side of the plane you sit on has anything to do with building a winning program. I said, that's really not the point. The point is the obsession with details. Do you not think that they're going to be, if they're going to be obsessed about these things, they're not going to be obsessed about the exact routes the receivers run, the steps that the linemen take, the steps that the quarterback takes, the meetings that they have about the details of those meetings, etc. Focus on the details, details, details. Become a transformational coach. We talked about that with Joe Orman. Focus on the 4 questions to become a transformational coach and dig deep inside yourself to answer those questions for yourself. I found that great coaches became lifelong learners. They have stacks of books that they've read and videos that they've watched. They're 60 and 70 and 80 years old, have won championship after championship, and they continue to seek knowledge and wisdom. I encourage you to do the same. This is crucial, coaches. Remember, at the end of the day, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. I think this is really, really important. Ultimately, I mentioned Mike Harity had written this book, Coaching Wisdom. Chapter 1 in his book, after he studied coaches after coaches that were highly successful. Chapter 1, creating a caring environment. Create a caring, loving environment within your program. Ultimately, if you read the second bullet point here, caring about your athletes is arguably the most important thing that you can do as a coach. You have the unique opportunity to impact the hearts, minds, and performances of your athletes by reminding them that they have value. Show them that they think you're important. You think they're important. Demonstrate consistently that you genuinely care, and it might just win you a championship. Greg Popovich, I picked this up before they even won this year's championship. He said, people call me a disciplinarian all the time because I was in the military. But he said, yes, that may be correct. But a lot of great companies have discipline. You need to. But that's not enough. Ultimately, I thought this was great. Relationships with people are what it's all about. You have to make the players realize you care about them, and then they have to begin to care about each other and be interested in one another. And then they start to feel a responsibility towards each other. Then they want to do for each other. And coaches, that's when the magic starts happening. Everybody wants an advantage, right? Everybody wants to get an edge. If you create that winning, that loving, caring environment. Here's what the winningest softball coach, Sue Ankers, won 10 national championships at UCLA softball. She said, if we have a team that loves each other, we are at a huge advantage. I will tell you, this is an absolute common denominator. Whether you talk about UCLA's teams or whether you talk about Messiah soccer, men's and women's soccer, or whether you talk about Jim Steen at Kenyon, whether you talk about Bob Laddiser's long win streak, 151 straight wins at De La Salle, 12 years without losing a game, common denominator is creating a loving, caring environment within their programs. They may forget what you said, Coach, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. Remember, to conclude this, Coach Wooden considers the most important word in the English language to be love. Coach Laddiser considers love to be an absolute key to the success of the program at De La Salle. And Joe Ehrman considers love to be a powerful force in becoming a transformational coach. Focus on investing in your players and becoming a transformational coach with love and caring about your players at the core. Ultimately, if you'd like to contact me, there's my website is johncmccarthyjr.com. If you'd like to email me, it's johncmccarthyjr@gmail.com. I'll be happy to open it up for any questions or comments if you would like. Other than that, I sincerely thank you for taking the time to be with me today. Thank you so much.
All right, great. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. That was awesome. Right now what we're going to do is I'm going to take back control of the screen here, and we're going to go through some questions. So, coaches, first of all, you can submit your questions one of two ways. You can first submit your questions by that question section of the webinar control panel. So just type your question in that question section and send it over to me. Or else, if you're using a telephone, you can click on the yellow hand that looks like actually it looks like a yellow hand. So click on that yellow hand. You can ask a live question. And then I'll unmute your phone and you can ask a live question. But the best way is just to type your question in that question section and send it over to me. Coaches, real quick, I'm going to go through some quick announcements to give you some time to think of your questions and to ask them. A little bit about Head Coach Academy. At Head Coach Academy, we provide free live webinars covering the most crucial executive aspects of head coaching, which include planning and organization, leadership and culture, and money and people. Here's our upcoming webinar schedule. We have a webinar next Tuesday. Coach Rich Zaslowski, he's the CEO of Better Basketball and head boys basketball coach at Crystal Lake Central High School in Illinois. So we're excited about that. Make Sport Decals your go-to guy for helmet decals, spirit packs, and more. Their promise is to provide you with the highest quality, fastest delivery, and lowest prices guaranteed, or your order is free. Call their award-winning customer service agents today, or visit them online at sportdecals.com. Colorado State University is offering college credit for viewing Head Coach Academy webinars and completing some additional coursework. 1 to 3 semester hours are available through leadership training, and 1 to 3 semester hours are available through an independent study. Please contact Dr. Rick Becker for more information. Okay, John, real quick, here's our questions. Does publishing stats in youth sports go against any kind of these principles?
That's a difficult question. There's the pros and the cons to that, but I think it's a matter of what age are we talking about. If we're talking about publishing statistics and truly making them public, even beyond the team, I would discourage that at a young age. As you get to older, as you get to high school and so on, it seems to make sense because there can be some value in that a coach working with their student athletes in some areas, possibly using statistics as a guide. But I don't see a whole lot of value in doing it publicly with young sports. No, I would discourage that with young sports. High school, I would encourage coaches to use them with the team, but unless a sports information director or a school thinks there's some value in publishing them, certainly from a promotional standpoint for your program, by the time you're high school varsity sports, I think that makes sense. But a youth sports, I would discourage that.
All right, great. Thanks, John. Next question. In what situations would you ask your athletes questions like, how do you feel about being coached by me? Just what situations would you ask that?
I would do that away from the court. I would do that either individually in the office or in a library or somewhere in a comfortable setting where the student athletes feel comfortable to speak up. And I think what's going to be really important about that is to tie that in with what we talked about at the end, is creating a loving, caring environment. And by doing that, the student athletes are going to feel more comfortable with you as a coach if you've created a loving, caring environment where they feel open to be able to discuss things with you, as opposed to feeling feared by the head coach. But I would do that away from the court, and it's up to the coach, depending on the team setting and the dynamics of the team, whether you do that as a whole team, or whether you do that individually, or whether you do that in small groups. I don't think that necessarily matters, but it does. I think it's important that the coach understands their team, and whatever setting they feel like the student athlete's going to be most likely to open up to them as a coach, I think is really important. But again, away from the court.
All right, great. Thanks, John. Next question. If you are a coach who has a mindset of only caring about winning, A, how can you change your mindset? And then B, how can you show your team you've changed your mindset?
Good. Great questions there. First of all, I would absolutely, if you're one of those coaches, first of all, I'd read Inside Out Coaching from Joe Arman. It's really, really good stuff. But I'd also dig into the 4 questions and dig into your real own values as a human being, as a person. What's important to you, and eventually learn to model those behaviors. And it becomes a mindset. I want to really stop, and I want to emphasize an important point here. I think that's a great question. What I'm talking about here is not easy. It is absolutely not. I think coaches, myself included, by nature are often very competitive people. And there's a part of that that's very good. The challenge is to now move that competitive nature into the right area, the right dynamics, and away from the scoreboard in terms of getting competitive about the details. Please understand, I'm not suggesting when I say create a loving, caring environment that we sit around in a circle, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya, and we're going to win a ton of games. These coaches are highly disciplined coaches that are highly organized, highly detailed coaches. And so with that, to become a transformational coach, really dig into those 4 questions. Now, how do you show that to the team is a difficult one, especially if you've typically been a transactional coach through the early part of your career or through your career up until this point. But I think what's really going to be important is to have the open, honest discussion with your team early on about your priorities. And I'll give a quick example. Danny Miles with his team, when I asked him about what his priorities are for his team, he went through his 3 priorities for his team. Keep in mind, Danny Miles won the national championship in 2004, 2008, 2012, has won 1,000 games now, and none of his priorities as a team have anything to do with winning the conference championship, making a national tournament, winning a national championship, winning X number of games. They all talk about the development of their players. So in order to show this to your team, I would align your priorities as a team with your priorities, with your values, with what your program stands for. Instead of always talking about, hey, our goal this year is to win the conference championship or make the state tournament and so on, align your goals with the transformational purpose.
All right, great. Thanks, John. Next question here. When interviewing for a head coaching position and you give your coaching philosophy, do you think it's acceptable to discuss this type of philosophy?
I would say this. I just had lunch with a collegiate athletic director about a week and a half ago, and he said one of the questions he always asks coaches in the interview at the collegiate level is, why do you coach? And he said, if that person doesn't have an answer that has something to do with character development or teaching life lessons, he said, regardless of what their resume said, he said, I move on to the next coach. So I would flip that question around and say that I highly encourage you to make sure that these things are not only acceptable. I think that quality athletic directors are going to absolutely look for that in a head coach. So let's be honest, by the time you get an interview for a head coaching position, whether it's junior high, whether it's high school, whether it's JV, whether it's college, you're usually in a pool with coaches that are pretty good and have a pretty good resume, if you will, in terms of wins and losses, typically. With that in mind, what's the edge and what's the important thing is that you can show a athletic director of character that you care genuinely about the student athletes and you care about their development as human beings, as people. So I would flip that around and say, absolutely, please bring it up. If you don't, I think you may be walking yourself out of a job.